All right, YouTube, it's time for another video on libertarian philosophy. It seems that some people persist in believing that libertarianism is all about corporations can do whatever they want because they happen to be private. I would like to say that in a vacuum, if there was no government intervention whatsoever into any aspect of corporations, into any aspect of business, into any aspect of private life, that is, you're living in a vacuum with a more or less absence of government. That is, the government is there but does nothing. It's just one step from anarchy or something. Under that system, you could say that that's okay, that corporations and businesses can choose to do whatever they want because they're not being leaned on by the government to do things. However, we do not live in a free market in the United States. That's a violation right there of the very ethos of libertarianism as it relates to fiscal policy. The government takes your money, your taxpayer money, this is why we need to slash taxes, and it doles it out to banks and corporations and businesses to build a certain lug nut for the military, or loan money to a specific group of disenfranchised minorities, or subsidize a particular aspect of production. And it doesn't work. Anytime the government actually does these things, it makes the overall economy worse. The government is capable of propping up an ailing segment of the economy, but it will always come at the expense of others. The problem is once one of these subsidies or contracts or whatever it happens to be comes into existence, the government almost never relinquishes it. It's through the steady amalgamation of these things that things get pricier and pricier and the economy becomes less and less stable. The government cannot simply say that it will outsource its abuse, its authoritarianism, to the private market and expect libertarians to be okay with that. It doesn't matter. If the government, for example, said, well, we aren't capable of passing laws against firearms because there's an explicit Second Amendment which explicitly protects the individual right to keep and bear arms. But I know what we'll do instead is we'll try to coerce large corporations to make sure that their workers are disarmed and fire people if they own weapons. Would you be okay with this? The answer is probably no. At least if you're on the right or if you're a libertarian, the answer is almost certainly no, and I would say most independents would feel the same way. There might be a slim proportion of liberals who think that would be a great idea, and they'll see this video and they'll be calling up their congressman to try to cajole them into doing such a bill. But would you be okay with it? I would hope not, because obviously the government's simply working around the Constitution. The government can't work around the Constitution through the privatization of abuse and hope to have any different outcome. That is, the same thing has happened, you've just privatized it. It's like airport screenings with the TSA. You get a transport authority that's bureaucratic in nature. It's not a direct arm of the government. It's kind of, sort of, in a way, a little bit almost privatized. And they scan people's nude bodies and strip them down, and they do all of these other things that are unconstitutional. It's clearly a violation of the privacy of American citizens. And yet we tolerate it because we perceive that transport authority as being somehow different from the government itself. All these bureaucratic alphabet soup agencies, one thing that shields them is the government is hundreds of thousands of pages long. It is arcane and convoluted. And so if the government is not capable of doing something, it attempts to delegate that authority to a bureau. And if the bureau is unable still, under legal means, to do something, it will attempt to delegate that authority to corporations. For example, one of the problems that I have with this deal that's going forth between the European Union's governments and groups like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter is that these are simply ways in which various governments are trying to work around civil rights, trying to work around the free speech and the free enterprise of the internet, to try to stifle creative content, to try to stifle opinions they themselves have issue with. They realize they can't do it through force, so they are attempting to sweeten the deal to pay off corporations that control a great proportion of the flow of information in the entire world in order to do it for them. It's like what the NSA is doing. The NSA and Congress were warned by a federal court. The NSA's domestic surveillance program is unconstitutional. What did Congress do? Congress should have simply removed the NSA from operation altogether. It should have abolished this kind of domestic surveillance as being number one, unconstitutional, number two, inordinately expensive, and number three, doesn't really have a purpose. It doesn't actually stop any terrorism. What did Bitch McConnell and all of these other retards in Congress do instead? They said, oh, we're not allowed to take all this information. Oh, I know, we'll have private companies store it for us. We'll just get them to store the information. Therefore, it's not on government servers, and we can still use the FISA courts. We can get a rubber-stamped warrant. It's not technically constitutional in the form of a warrant, but we can get a rubber-stamped de facto warrant and go through that information at our leisure. We'll just have the private companies store it for us. And so they attempted to work around, once again, the right to privacy inherent within the Constitution. This happens with the 10th Amendment, with the rights of the states. The federal government realizes it can't force the states to do a lot of what the federal government wants the states to do. So what does it do instead? It ups the tax rate. I've explained this before. It drives up taxes so the states need more money back from the federal government because now they've got a deficit. They have to stretch their income, and states necessarily have to compete with one another. Some states will buddy-buddy with the federal government. Others won't, but the ones that won't, they will still temper what they want to do. They will usurp their own independence as states in order to suck at the federal teat out of necessity because of the way in which an interventionist system drives competition, which is a lopsided method of doing business. The government then sets up a fund with the same money it just robbed from the people of the states and disperses it back, but makes it requisite upon the states doing certain things, like the drinking age. The drinking age can be lowered to 10 by any state at any given time. A state could abolish the concept altogether so that a 5-year-old can walk into the store and buy a beer if it really wanted to. It could do the same with tobacco, but the federal government has made so much money requisite upon them keeping it at 21 that they're never going to do that, especially with highway funding, which is retarded. It's a way to work around the 10th Amendment. It's like the First Amendment. The federal government, and in many ways the states, are not actually capable of telling you can't protest without a permit. It's not constitutional. So they lean on municipalities to do it instead because the threshold at which they do something unconstitutional is perceived as being different. Now, I don't perceive it as different. I see it as the same form of abuse. But simply privatizing something, telling a corporation abuse the population, does not exonerate the government. The government is still intervening in the situation and trying to get that to happen, like with web censorship. I would like to point out the same people that have this weird stick up their ass about libertarianism, the only real coherent argument they can formulate against it is also a straw man, which posits that libertarianism is a form of corporate control. But corporate control is just as abusive. Corporations will necessarily be controlled. As far as the markets are concerned, if you force them to compete on an even keel with local and regional businesses, many of those corporations will shrink. You will have a more even-handed system. A business goes belly up, other businesses fill the gap. You're not going to see corporations monopolize into one God Almighty national corporation under a libertarian model, because there will always be competition, especially from entrepreneurs, especially from small businesses, which right now, can actually compete. Because we're not in a free market system. We're in an interventionist system. Corporations get billions a year in your money in kickbacks in order to outcompete small businesses because they've got a contract with the military or a contract with the CIA or because some fucking senator happens to have been on the board at one point in the past and they use that money from the corporation to run for office in the first place. Or because that corporation paid somebody off under the table to get a law passed or a law not passed. That's how it works. That relies on interventionism. If you don't have government interventionism, then that can never actually happen. What we should do is make the distinguishing factor this. Back in the barren era of the late 1800s, one of the reasons why corporations and government drew together and became so corrupt is because there was no specific manner in which people could tell them no. The private market and government essentially should be separate. Corporations are not people. Corporations shouldn't be donating anything to a politician. There was no law against it, and there still isn't a law in many cases. What we need to do is crack down on that, pass laws in order to differentiate the two, keep the private market free of government intervention and keep the government free of private market intervention, beyond capped donations from individuals and beyond voting, which is exactly what should happen. Citizens United, yeah, it should be overturned. It should be replaced with something more ironclad that will prevent the government from getting all this funny money from all of these rich donors. I'd say the banks, they do the same thing. Why do you think Obama bailed the banks out with taxpayer money? By simply printing a bunch more. By the way, one final aside that has a little bit less to do with the core message of this video, which is essentially, no, simply privatizing authoritarianism doesn't mean it's not authoritarianism. When the government prints a bunch of money to pay for one of these things, what do you think it actually is? It's a tax on everybody, from the richest to the poorest, because it devalues the currency. And so the money that you've got in savings, or the money you're making at your job, is now worth a little bit less. It's still a form of tax. It's just a tax that the government can enact at any given time at a whim, with the Federal Reserve in tow, in order to make them all richer. It's also a good way to tyrannize the population. There are various methods behind how you do this. Soros does it all the time. So do the Kochs and all of these other retards. And the people at the Fed themselves. And we shouldn't bother to audit the Federal Reserve. We should just abolish it. That's about all. Peace out.